The really big issue, the elephant in the room, if you say, is the dumping of steel, the price of steel globally, and therefore, as a result, the rise globally in trade defence instruments and putting up barriers to trade. So we're seeing that across the globe. Some countries, some regions are quicker and better than others, and that creates a problem, and I can expand upon that. But why are we seeing a rise in trade defence instruments? Well, it's because China last year exported something like 112 million tonnes of steel onto the global market. China is a sector which is 70% state-owned, which we understand loses something like $34 per tonne of steel that they make. So what they're doing there is not putting onto the market cheap, really cheap steel. What they're doing is putting onto the market underpriced, state-supported, unfairly traded steel, and that's not sustainable going forward.
But China is the driver to reduce the world price of steel. There's no question about that. The world price, China is a leader in terms of leading the price down. I don't really think that is through dumping. If you test the Chinese steel prices in domestic prices versus export prices, their domestic prices are same or cheaper than their export prices. So, it's not like they're selling at a high price domestically and dumping it in the world. China doesn't do that. China is not exporting steel at much lower prices than it sells domestically. They have the world's best steel plants now because they're the newest. So they have large scale plants. So they have the lowest cost of production. They're just very good at making low cost steel. When they have a surplus, they are exporting. Actually, again, there is China is not very good at representing itself on the world stage, because when people talk about Chinese government providing subsidies for export, actually on the contrary, what they do is they actually tax exports. Because what they do is they have a 17% VAT tax in China. So they only allow a part of that to be refunded when steel is exported. So in effect, they actually tax exports. So I don't think China is dumping steel, in my opinion. Cheap Chinese steel has an impact on the world, has a detrimental effect on the world. And I think the only justification for protection would be, in my opinion, that steel is a cyclical commodity, and sooner or later steel will come back into rebalance. Prices will come back into reasonable, healthy level. And when that happens, in the interim, if you have destroyed your industry because of cheap imports, then it's very difficult to restart the industry, even though it's viable to produce steel again.
Anti-dumping and protectionism, I'm not particularly in favour of. I don't think it actually solves the fundamental problems. Certainly history tells us that. I mean, clearly the US have been very quick to apply them, and as they always have done. Europe tends to be much slower, but any cases that are ever brought take a very long time before they actually achieve anything. And by that stage, the market's moved on and people forget about it. If you conceptualize that in total and everyone closes the market, there'll be no free trade, and that's in no one's interest. So it's a potential short-term measure that won't serve or solve the actual bigger problem. So I'm not particularly pro protectionism.
There are people that believe that they don't work and that we need to think about something else. I think they're wrong. I think what we need to see perhaps actually is much more, not perhaps, definitely is much more robust and higher tariffs to tackle it. So picking up 9% tariffs on rebar entering from China into the EU, that's not really going to help. That's not going to tackle the problem when the actual calculated dumping margin is 66%. So, I would say that some commentators, traders might say trade defence instruments don't work. Perhaps they want perhaps higher tariffs, because then they would work. The thing that I would argue that when users say, oh, we need the cheaper, unfairly traded material, well, it doesn't. Trade defence instruments don't stop them for two things. One, finding other sources for that steel. It doesn't mean that they have to buy it from the EU. Trade defence instruments potentially don't block out all exporters, but also, you could still buy that steel from, say if it's China, it's against China, you can still buy the steel from China it's just being bought at a more realistic cost, rather than a cost which actually doesn't reflect the cost of production and actually doesn't reflect the longer term sustainable cost of that steel.
It may not be a popular view amongst certain components of the industry because it's a threat, but I don't see what would stop it. I don't see how the world will be able to say how we'll be able to stop that happening. And I think it's a positive move. I don't think it's China's made the cost of a lot of products globally much cheaper than they were, and that's a positive move for the world, for every economy, for the consumer. A lot of the products which we were used, a lot of costs have come down on a lot of products, including steel, because of Chinese mass production. And that's a positive thing for the world. It's not a negative thing. So, let's say some of the steel plants in the UK which have already closed, if they will never come back, in my opinion, even if the prices recover, because they will never recover to the degree which it allows enough profit to really regroup skills, labor, market share, investment. I mean, steel plants are like a human body. Once you take the soul out of the body, it's very difficult to restart them, and we've been through that. So that's the only justification for protection, that if you don't protect, then even when the market does return, which it will eventually, you won't be able to restart. But that's just because that's justification, not that China is dumping steel in the market. I don't think China is dumping steel in the market.
At the moment, the products you hear about within a European context are reinforcing bar. But again, and maybe having been around a long time, we've seen these things before. I mean, reinforcing bar 20 years ago, I think around that, they brought out CARES, a quality assurance standard. Now that was a form of protectionism. But what does it do? It buys you some time where an offshore supplier, they will apply and also gain CARES approval, and there are many others today. So you can try and put up a barrier. Ingenuity may prevail and people will find ways around it, but ultimately you need to get back to an open market, and that's where I come from.
Perhaps we do need legislative change. So what we need, if we're thinking about, say, the lesser duty rule, the Commission would like to remove the lesser duty rule, which would enable the Commission to come up with more robust tariffs. But member states, or certain member states, including the UK, are blocking the scrapping of the lesser duty rule. So what we actually need, it's not just on the Commission, it doesn't all lie with, come on Commission, speed things up. It actually also lies with member states. And so we would call on the UK government to stop opposing the scrapping of the lesser duty rule, to actually turn around completely and say, yeah, we do need probably to get rid of the lesser duty rule so we can have realistic tariffs on imported steel into the European Union that would actually really would tackle the problem in the short term. Trade defence instruments aren't for the longer term, but certainly in the short term, they are the answer to the problem that we have. And we're going to see a raft of other trade defence instruments springing up all over the world, and we're almost seeing that on a weekly basis now, and that's going to continue. So if we ignore that, we ignore that at our peril.